The first thing I noticed when I stepped off the transport plane was the quiet. Not that peaceful kind of quiet, like when you're out in the countryside. This one was oppressive, like the Arctic itself was holding its breath. The icy expanse stretched in all directions, stark white against the pale blue sky, and the only sound was the low hum of the wind. The base was barely visible in the distance, a cluster of steel buildings half buried in snow. A single plume of smoke rose from one of the chimneys, twisting against the frigid air. I adjusted my scarf and pulled my coat tighter before going onward. I was the newest biologist on the team. The project was supposed to be simple, analyzing core samples from the ice shelf for evidence of microbial life. My specialty was extremophiles, organisms that thrive in the harshest environments on Earth. This job should have been my dream, but something about the base felt wrong. The first sign was the look on the pilot's face when he dropped me off. He didn't say a word as he unloaded my gear, but he kept glancing at the base, his jaw tight. When I thanked him, he only muttered, "Be careful," before climbing back into the plane. As I approached the main building, the snow crunching under my boots, I noticed something else. The windows were frosted over, but not from the cold. They were coated with frost from the inside. The base's common room was dimly lit, the only source of warmth a wood stove in the corner. 4 people sat around a battered table. Dr. Reyes, the base's lead researcher, Barrett, the grizzled geologist, McCready, the radio operator, and a woman I didn't recognize. Her name tag read Dr. Codwell. Reyes stood to greet me. She was tall with sharp features and a no-nonsense air about her. "Dr. Harper," she said, extending a hand. "Welcome to hell." "Thanks," I said, trying to smile, but her words sent a chill down my spine. Barrett grunted without looking up from his coffee. McCready gave me a small nod, but Caldwell just stared at me. There was something off about her gaze, like she was trying to figure out what I was doing here. "We've got a tight schedule," Reyes said. "I'll show you your quarters, and then we'll debrief you on the project. Dinner's at 1800. Don't wander outside after dark. It's easy to get lost out there." The base was cramped, a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms, each one packed with equipment. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and something faintly metallic. Reyes showed me to my room, a tiny space with a bunk, a desk, and a single window that looked out onto the endless white void. That night, over dinner, Reyes explained the project. "The core samples are from about a mile below the surface," she said. "The ice down there is ancient, untouched for tens of thousands of years. We've already found traces of microbial life, things no one's ever seen before." Barrett snorted. "That's not the half of it." Reyes shot him a warning look, but I pressed. "What do you mean?" Barrett leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "We found something else. Something bigger. We found something else. Something bigger." "Bigger?" I asked. "It's classified," Reyes snapped, her tone sharp. "Focus on your work, Dr. Harper. That's all you need to know." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few nights later, I woke to a strange sound, scratching, like nails on metal. It was faint, but in the stillness of the Arctic night, it felt deafening. I sat up, my breath visible in the frigid air. The scratching was coming from the hallway. Slowly, I opened my door and stepped out. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small window at the far end. The scratching had stopped, but my skin prickled with unease. I followed the faint trail of sound to the storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and the air inside was freezing. Caldwell was standing in the center of the room. Her back was to me, and she was hunched over something I couldn't see. "Dr. Caldwell?" I said. She didn't respond. I stepped closer. "Are you okay?" She turned slowly, and I froze. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, and her lips were cracked and raw. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was wrong, like she was trying to speak through a mouthful of water. I glanced down and saw what she was holding. A piece of ice, about the size of a football. Something was embedded in it. A dark, twisted shape that looked almost like a... "Don't touch it!" she hissed, clutching the ice closer to her chest. The next day, Reyes called a meeting. "It's come to my attention that some of you are concerned about the core samples. she said, her tone clipped. Let me make this clear. We're here to conduct research, nothing else. Barrett folded his arms. What about Caldwell? She hasn't been herself since she worked on that last sample. Dr. Caldwell is fine, Reyes snapped. A little sleep deprived, perhaps, but fine. Let's stay focused. But Caldwell wasn't fine. That night, I heard her talking to herself in her room. Her voice was low and guttural, like two people speaking at once. And then, the power went out. The power outage plunged the base into utter darkness. In a place like this, where night stretches endlessly, losing the light feels like being swallowed alive. I scrambled for my flashlight, my breath clouding in the freezing air as I flicked it on. The hallway outside my room was empty, but the silence wasn't normal. It was oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. Caldwell? I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. No response. From somewhere deeper in the base, I heard a faint, wet sound, a dragging noise, punctuated by muffled scraping. I followed the noise toward the storage room. As I moved closer, the temperature dropped. The walls were frosted over, and my boots crunched on the ice that shouldn't even have been there. The door to the storage room was wide open. Inside, Caldwell stood in the center of the room, hunched over the same piece of ice I'd seen her clutching before. Only now, the ice was shattered, the shards of it scattered across the floor. In its place was something alive. The thing was small, about the size of a dog, and it was slick with what looked like black slime. Its shape was wrong. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its body seemed to writhe and shift as if it wasn't solid. Caldwell reached down and stroked it, her fingers trembling. Beautiful, isn't it? She whispered, not looking at me. What the hell is that? I demanded, stepping back. She finally turned to face me. Her eyes were fully black now, glistening like wet obsidian. Her mouth split into a grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that had grown sharp and uneven. It's been waiting, she said, her voice no longer her own. It was layered and human, with a deep, resonant growl beneath it. And now, it's awake. I ran. Reyes and Barrett were in the common room arguing by candlelight when I burst in. It's Caldwell! I shouted. She's not... What are you talking about? Reyes snapped, but Barrett's face paled. It's starting. Reyes whipped around to glare at him. What do you mean, it's starting? Barrett hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. We dug too deep, he said. Found something we shouldn't have. That ice. It's not just ancient. It's alive. Some kind of parasite. It got into Caldwell. Maybe others too. Reyes shook her head. That's ridiculous. But I could see the doubt in her eyes. As if to prove Barrett's point, the base's radio crackled to life, even though the power was still out. A distorted, guttural voice came through. It's hungry. We froze. Who's there? Reyes demanded, grabbing the radio mic. It's already inside. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the hallway. Caldwell stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. Her body twitched and jerked, her limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Reyes grabbed the emergency axe mounted on the wall, her hands trembling. Stay back, she warned. Caldwell smiled. Too late, she said before lunging forward. The chaos that followed was a blur. Reyes swung the axe, but Caldwell moved too fast, her body bending and twisting unnaturally. Barrett grabbed a chair and swung it, but she swatted him aside with inhuman strength. I ran for the lab. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I needed to get out of there. As I ran through the narrow hallways, I passed a frost-covered window and caught a glimpse of something moving outside. The shadows on the ice weren't human. I barricaded myself in the lab and searched desperately for something, anything that could help. That's when I saw the samples. The cores, taken from deep beneath the ice. They were still in their containers, but one of them was cracked. A vicious black liquid had seeped out, pooling onto the counter. The parasite. Barrett burst into the lab, his face pale and bloody. It's spreading, he gasped. Reyes, she's gone. Caldwell got her. What do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. Barrett didn't answer. Instead, He grabbed one of the core containers and smashed it open. "What are you doing?" I shouted. He held up a shard of ice. Inside was a frozen fragment of the parasite, its twisted form barely visible. "This is it," he said. "This is the source. If we destroy it, maybe we can stop the infection." Before I could respond, the lights flickered back on. Standing in the doorway was Reyes, or what was left of her. Her face was barely recognizable, her skin stretched and splitting, her eyes black and empty. She staggered forward, her limbs contorting as the parasite inside her struggled to reshape her body. Barrett threw the ice at her feet, and she stopped. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if the parasite inside her recognized the fragment. Then, she screamed. The sound was deafening, shaking the walls of the lab and sending a blast of icy wind through the room. The parasite in the ice began to writhe, its black liquid seeping out and reaching for her. Barrett grabbed a blowtorch from the counter. "Get out!" he shouted, igniting the flame. I ran. Behind me, I heard the whoosh of fire and the sound of something inhuman shrieking. The heat from the flames warmed my back, but it did nothing to thaw the icy dread in my chest. I made it outside just as the lab exploded, a plume of fire and smoke rising into the pale Arctic sky. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from deep beneath the ice, I heard a sound, a low, resonant hum, like the ice itself was alive. The fire may have destroyed the lab, but it didn't kill that parasite. It only woke it up.